When the United States got its independence in 1783, there was no longer a Royal Navy to protect American trade. The British had an interest in seeing American ships get captured because they were trading rivals of us. Very rapidly in the 1780s, a number of American ships were captured and taken into Algiers, and that's what caused the American Navy to be founded in 1794. The Washington administration in 1796 paid the astronomical sum of $650,000 to ransom the survivors from those ships. This was a terrible ordeal for people to be enslaved in Barbary. And most of their their finances relied on this prisoner ransoming business. And to avoid this problem, a lot of the European countries would pay what was called tribute. It was essentially a racket. It was a bribe, so that instead of having to pay ransom each time a ship was captured, they would pay annual tribute in the form of pounds or francs or ducats or sequins to prevent their ships from being captured. And these deals were respected by the various regimes.
Finally, President George Washington decided that we need a United States Navy of our own, and he signed the Naval Armament Act of 1794, commissioning 6 new United States Navy frigates.
Now, because we made a treaty with Algiers, which was the offending Barbary power in the 1790s, Congress decided to only complete 3 of them, Constellation, the United States, and the Constitution, and the other 3 were more or less left where they were. They were then completed later.
So the United States makes peace with Algiers in 1795 and promises that every year we will send Algiers military supplies so that Algiers will leave American ships alone. And Algiers does leave American ships alone. The problem is the United States never actually sends any of the supplies promised.
Well, Jacob Jones served under John Barry, who was one of the few holdovers from the American Revolution, who had served in the Continental Navy and had a fine reputation. And he had been made the commanding officer of the USS United States. And so he learned his trade under John Barry, which would lead eventually to his promotion, his creation as the commanding officer of his own vessels. He joined the U.S. Navy in 1799 in its first appearance. He was several years older, but he hadn't had seafaring experience before he had gotten into that Navy.
It's the who's who of the Navy at the time, and but they would experience rapid change both culturally, politically, and in the Navy during the time of their service. You cast off the yoke of Great Britain during the American Revolution. Jacob would have experienced that as a young boy. You have the quasi-war with France for 2 years. You have the first Barbary War, where we're defending American sovereignty once again and stamping out American slavery at the hands of the Barbary states. And then you have the War of 1812, where we put a nix on impressment, and no longer are American sailors pressed to serve in the British Navy. Technologically, you have steam coming into fruition. I mean, it's the earliest steam vessels that were tested out, and Jacob and fellow officers were brought down to New York to experience this. They were some of the leading men of the U.S. Navy at this time.
After the war with France ends, a lot of the midshipmen and young officers were cut because we no longer need a big Navy. The Jefferson administration cuts military spending, so why do we need a big Navy? So not only is it notable that Jones is promoted to lieutenant, it's also notable they keep him on the roster of officers because he had shown capability as an officer, able to lead, which is the essential thing, also able to command a ship, which he had not done until, as a doctor, you don't get a lot of experience in sailing.
Congress didn't take their first steps for a Navy until October 75. By that time, Washington had 5 ships. Those 5 ships captured some ships.
In 1800, William Bainbridge brings the USS George Washington into Algiers, and the Dey of Algiers says, "You're overdue with the tribute you owe me, and thus I can command you." And the United States was heavily in debt to Algiers and also to a banking family in Algiers that had been helping to sustain the American envoy there and so on. And so Algiers wouldn't go attack American ships. And Bainbridge really doesn't have a choice other than to carry the Dey's tribute to Istanbul. And so Bainbridge, his ship is commandeered by the Dey to sail to Istanbul carrying the Dey's tribute to the Sultan. And the tribute included enslave people from across the Sahara Desert, as well as animals from Africa, as well as goods from Algiers and from the countries to the south. So Bainbridge is given the task then of carrying the tribute of the Day of Algiers to Istanbul. And they arrive in Istanbul, or what we would then have called Constantinople, and no one really recognizes this flag. This is the first American warship to come to Constantinople or to Istanbul. And Bainbridge finds the day isn't held in less regard in Istanbul than the Americans are. When Bainbridge arrives, the harbor master wants to know, what country are you from? And Bainbridge says, the United States of America. Well, we've never heard of that. Well, we're from America. Well, where is that? And then finally the guy says, do you mean the New World? And that's it, we're from the New World. And then they say, well, you know, we have a moon and a star on our flag, you have stars on your flag, we think there'll be a great relationship between our two countries. And Bainbridge has a dinner party aboard the George Washington where they serve water from the four continents, because of course the naval ship stops different places to get water. So in Istanbul, the George Washington feeds these guests with water from North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Great event, great moment in our history, thinking how an American warship can bring all of these folks together. And once Bainbridge unloads the tribute, he then sails out of Constantinople, out of Istanbul, quite happy to be out of it. But then you can see the mark this has. The frigate named for our first president carrying the tribute of the Day of Algiers to Istanbul. And in fact, during the trip, some of the Muslims aboard charged that Bainbridge was purposefully changing the way that he was navigating when they were all facing toward Mecca, that he's doing this intentionally. So, and of course, you're sailing the ship. But all in all, this is a huge embarrassment. Well, it would have been a big embarrassment had people in the United States really been paying attention to what was happening in the Mediterranean.
The United States had gained their independence 30 years earlier during the Revolutionary War, but we really weren't treated like a true international power or sovereign nation, particularly by France and Great Britain. While they're going through their huge war in the early 1800s, they imposed trade restrictions upon the growing American merchant fleet when really we just wanted to maintain neutrality. British imposed the Orders in Council that says the United States cannot trade with France. France imposed the Napoleonic Decree so that we cannot trade with Great Britain. It was really suffocating our expansion and our growth across the world.
Midshipmen isn't signing up for a cruise. Ordinary sailors are. A midshipman is signed up to be a midshipman, and then he is assigned to a ship. One of the first places where Jones and Decatur are together is on the USS President under the command of John Rodgers. And Rodgers is one of the first captains in the early Navy, and someone will have a big role later on as a naval commissioner and so on. So all of the first officers were remarkably good, but also remarkably tough. They didn't really show favorites. What they wanted to know is what you were able to do. The fact that Decatur's father had been a privateer captain doesn't impress them. In fact, they speak very ill of the senior Decatur's sailing skills. And as a captain, they think he's a big blowhard. And I think it's that kind of lesson that Jones and Decatur will get, how not to be an officer is probably one of the most important lessons they can get. As I said, officers like Rodgers or Preble are very good, but then they can see other examples that aren't so much. And it's a very important learning skill in any occupation, knowing what are the traits not only to emulate, but the ones to avoid.
So he was learning the ropes from Stephen Decatur. Now, they went to sea for the quasi-war with France briefly, but the United States, with Jacob aboard, didn't see any action.
Within about 3 or 4 years, he's a lieutenant, which is a major promotion for someone.
And right after the quasi-war with France, the First Barbary War broke out. People called it in those days the Tripolitan War. Barbary pirates who were taking our ships and our seamen as prisoners, captives in Tripoli, and were also demanding ransom for these people. By the time Thomas Jefferson was president, that ransom was so much that it would have broken the U.S. Treasury. So we had to do something about it. And so Jefferson, who originally had tried to decrease the Navy and almost disestablish the Navy, decided that he needed to send some squadrons of ships to the Mediterranean to do something about the Tripolitan pirates. Well, Jacob Jones went in the first 2 squadrons of ships, which were largely ineffective. On the first squadron, he sailed with the Constitution under Captain Silas Talbot.
This ship was ahead of its time when it was designed by a man named Joshua Humphreys. He envisioned a heavy frigate. The ship was rated as a 44-gun frigate. We had a combination of 24-pound long guns and 32-pound carronades on the main deck above us. This 24-pound long gun could fire a shot of about 24 pounds, about 1,000 yards, although by that range you'd lose velocity and a little bit of accuracy. It would take a team of 10 to 12 men to fire this gun, working together in unison, and they could do it in about, the United States Navy could do about 90 seconds. Compared to Great Britain and France, you could do it in about 3 minutes. That was a 2-to-1 advantage. Contrary to popular belief, we really didn't want to destroy the enemy ship at all. We really only wanted to disable it enough to send the United States Marines over to gain control of the ship so we could quickly fix it up and then use it against our enemies. That's how we built a larger Navy. So they had different munitions to do that. What you're looking at here is a 24-pound cannonball. Here is a 32-pound cannonball for our carronades on the top deck. One shot is bigger than the other, but imagine the heat of battle, smoke, the chaos. Men are getting injured. You could easily confuse one for the other, particularly when you think that the ship's youngest sailors, some as young as 8, 9, 10 years old, their responsibilities in battle were to go all the way down to the magazines and get these shot and then pre-stage them at the gun. The strength of Constitution's hull is the use of oak. There's a combination of white oak, which is very common for shipping, but the majority of the hull is live oak. This was Joshua Humphrey's claim to fame. He knew that it was the secret. The outer layer is white oak, the inner layer is white oak, and then that middle filling is live oak in long, tall, vertical stanchions going fore and aft all across the ship with only about 2 inches in between. This live oak is the strongest wood in North America. Joshua Humphreys knew that it was the secret. He was willing to commit to harvesting the wood that we got from Georgia. The reason why people were not using live oak is impossible to shape. It's very difficult to cut. He sent men down into the forest with plans of the ship so they could find trees that were already naturally contoured for the framing that he needed at each frame fore and aft. There's a pecking order to where the men would sleep. If you were a more senior enlisted, you would sleep outboard because you had a rare chance at getting a little bit of fresh air through the few airports that were here, but also you didn't mind the rocking and rolling of the ship in the wave action. If you were a brand new sailor, you wanted to sleep inboard because it was a little bit more stable, but the disadvantage to there is you're further away from the fresh air, and also as men were trafficking through the berth deck all night long, there was a good chance you'd accidentally get bumped and woken up while you're trying to sleep. The 10 to 12 man gun team would also sleep together in the James Terminal vicinity of the berthing deck. They would eat their meals together and they would hang out and commiserate here together as well. It's building that camaraderie.
There are cooks aboard, but also each mess will have its own cook who will take care of feeding his mess of about a dozen men per day. So if you're a sailor on one of these ships, you have to remember where your hammock is, or where your berth is. You also have to remember your station. Are you on the mainmast, or the foremast, or the mizzenmast? And what watch are you on? Because the watches, of course, rotate. And you also have to know what mess you are in. So you have these different places to remember where you are supposed to be. And if you're not in your place when you are supposed to be, that's really a very serious misdemeanor.
When I researched the condition on board 18th and 19th century naval vessel, I continued to be amazed about the harsh living conditions on board. These living conditions were a reflection of the society from which they originated, and the ordinary sailor had almost no possibility to acquire any prosperity, while the officers belonged to the social elite or maintained close relations with them. In principle, life on board was well organized at that time, and everyone on board was to expect to know the rules, and they were read to the crew regularly. Violations were severely punished by corporal punishment.